Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you're all having a good day. Many of you may have received a notice from us earlier today about World AIDS Day, and tomorrow is World AIDS Day. So to start with today, I'd like to introduce our Ambassador, Deborah Birx. Ambassador Birx is going to talk to us a little bit about U.S. Global AIDS Coordination and also a program called PEPFAR that I know many of you are familiar with. She's agreed to join me to say a few words about the annual results that were released today and show that the program has reached historic highs in HIV prevention and also treatment. At the United Nations General Assembly in September, Secretary Tillerson was proud to launch PEPFAR's strategy for accelerating HIV/AIDS epidemic control. It is a landmark strategy set as a bold course for accelerating progress toward epidemic control and reaffirmed the U.S. government's leadership and commitment through PEPFAR to support HIV/AIDS efforts in more than 50 countries. PEPFAR has not only saved and improved millions of lives, but it's also transformed the global HIV/AIDS response. With that, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Birx. She'll take a few of your questions, and then I'll follow up with the remainder of the briefing. I know you have a lot of questions today. Ambassador, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heather. It's great to be here. Good afternoon. Just quickly, just to let you know, we are at an unprecedented moment in the HIV/AIDS pandemic. For the first time in modern history, we have the opportunity to actually control the global pandemic without a vaccine or a cure. And this is a very exciting time for us. The United States remains the key leader of the HIV/AIDS response. And under this administration and leadership of President Donald Trump, we are continuing to lead in the response around the globe. Today we announced the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, historic highs, as just noted by Heather. We're actually preventing more HIV infections and saving more lives than ever before, and we're doing this driven by transparency, accountability, and cost-effective investments. One big reason for our great success in this last 12 months is we've really refined our approach and expanded our impact based on using the latest science around the globe that's available to us and the best available data, including data down to the actual sites of where they're delivering services to our clients. The results in enormous efficiency and cost effectiveness across the program. We're also ensuring that we have the greatest impact with our every dollar that's entrusted to us from the American public, both demonstrating the generosity and the compassion of the American people through their taxpayer dollars. When PEPFAR began in 2003, less than 50,000 people were on treatment in sub-Saharan Africa. Entire communities were decimated. Children were living without mothers and fathers. Schools went without teachers. Hospitals went without nurses and doctors. And today, in these same areas, we have nearly 13 million people on treatment because of PEPFAR. In addition, we've been focused over the last year heavily in prevention and preventing new infections in men and boys. We're using a new biomedical intervention, voluntary medical male circumcision. It's reached a historic high of 15 million, 3.4 million circumcisions just done in the last 12 months. And I think the most important announcement we have today, for the first time in the history of HIV/AIDS, we're announcing a dramatic decline in infections in young women and girls due to our DREAMS program. Stands for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe Young Women. We were in 63 districts, but 14 of them had more than a 40% decline in the infection rate in young women. Another 27 had declines of 25 to 40% in the rate of new infections, and nearly all the districts saw some improvement in the rate of infections in young women and girls. And this is the first time we've been able to have that kind of dramatic impact. It's this public-private partnership. It brings the strength of the private sector with the U.S. taxpayer dollars to have and augment our response, and we're very excited about that results. Finally, within orphans and vulnerable children, we're reaching over 6 million orphans and vulnerable children. We've prevented 2.2 million babies from being born with HIV because of care for their mothers and making sure that they receive life-saving treatment that both saves their lives so that they can be a mother to their children, but also prevents infection in their babies. So together today, we were excited about these new announcements, but we're also using this time to commemorate all of the people that we have lost to HIV/AIDS, really renewing our effort to have even a bigger and better and greater response over the next 12 months and have the impact that we believe can end up with controlling this pandemic over the next 3 years. Thank you.
Right.
I can take questions.
Ambassador, certainly. We can have time to take a few questions, and then I'll get started. I know you're all a curious bunch. Saeed, why don't you go right ahead?
Yes, I have a very quick question. How do you collect and maintain data on the rise or decline of HIV in conflict zones like Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq?
Yeah, so we are fortunate that over the last 30 years, the U.S. has supported UNAIDS in developing the data systems in conjunction with countries. So our reporting is supported both for UNAIDS with the U.S. co-investing in those both around the globe to ensure that data collections are correct. That's the advantage that the HIV/AIDS pandemic has had from the beginning, is we have the ability to map in great detail the progress that we're making, not only in the countries that I'm talking about where PEPFAR has a significant investment, those 50 countries, but throughout the world in the countries you just cited.
Okay, anything else? Josh.
There's been a major rise in HIV prevalence in Iran that the Iranian government's clearly trying to work on. We obviously don't have diplomatic relations really with them, but is there anything that we're doing through multilateral fora to try to help Iran address their epidemic?
Yeah, throughout the world, the U.S., remember, invests in the Global Fund, which is a very important fund that translates our dollars 2-for-1 to make them more impactful with the rest of the donor community. They work throughout the countries where often there isn't a direct U.S. presence. It's important to note that it's not just Iran with rising number of new infections. The greatest rise in new infections around the globe is in Russia, due to primarily key populations and the lack of responsiveness to addressing the depth and breadth of the epidemic there.
Okay, Connor from ABC.
Thank you for doing this, Ambassador. How do you square your desire to prevent more and new cases of HIV/AIDS with the Trump administration's push for major cuts of over, I think, $800 million to PEPFAR, $225 million to the Global Fund? In particular, the one organization released a report this week saying that the proposals would lead to, lead to 4 million more deaths and 26 million new HIV infections in sub-Saharan Africa over the next 15 years. Just a response to that.
Yeah, I think that's an important question to put in perspective. So since 2010, this program reached its highest investment in 2010. Since then, we've had a decrease in investment year over year. And that has been our responsibility to translate the dollars that we have into more and more effective programs. And that's why I really led with the concept of us increasing maximum efficiency and effectiveness, because we went into this year with a flat budget, yet we dramatically increased results. And I think you have to measure the administration's commitment to HIV/AIDS by their political will and willing to address and talk about PEPFAR, as the president did his inaugural address at the UN General Assembly, and the support that we get both from the State Department and the White House over these World AIDS Day. The president wrote out his proclamation today. That inspires the world that we can do more and be better. And I think that's, for us that manage programs within the U.S. government, it's always important to recognize that this money comes from our parents, ourselves, and our children. And translating that money into the most effective programs that we can, that reaches the most lives in the most impactful way, that's our job. And that's what we are really excited about being able to talk about today.
Any of those numbers, that there will be more deaths because of the cuts that the administration's proposed?
I haven't seen the report yet, but I look forward to reading it. I'm very data-driven, so I will be looking very carefully about the analysis, because we constantly are looking at data for how we can be better and do more with the resources we have.
Sir, right,
Yeah.
go ahead.
The World AIDS Day is, we all know every year is on December 1st. But today, the president has issued and declared that it's a December 1 as the World AIDS Day. Reading through the whole thing from the White House, there's no mention about any additional grant or money or anything. How do you see till the next December 1st, your funds being, with all the cuts in the State Department budget and the cuts, overall federal cuts, how do you see this declaration adding any value to?
First, it demonstrates amazing political will, and not every government and administration is willing to talk about HIV/AIDS, willing to talk about the people who are affected by HIV/AIDS. This administration is not only willing to talk about it, but willing to actually commemorate the day and ensure that we continue in the next 12 months to march forward in a very productive way to meet our goals. And I think that's a great question for you to ask me a year from now, because we believe that we're going to continue to accelerate our program as we did in the last 12 months, despite a very flat or decreasing budget.
And sir, from Al Jazeera, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Thank you. Abdurrahim from Al Jazeera. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you face in dealing with HIV/AIDS in a time of great migration movements such as what we're seeing from Africa and the Middle East into Europe? That's number one. Number two, can you talk a little bit about, in terms of your progress, about the overlap between what you do to achieve that progress or have done and what governments in the regions concerned have done?
Great, thank you for that question, because if I didn't make it feel like this is a partnership between communities, host government, and our multilateral colleagues and bilateral donors, I was mistaken. So let me really emphasize that our progress today is only possible, and you can see where we make the most progress in each country. It is when the governments have the political will to have the policies and the comprehensive approach that we know are critical for both preventing new infections and treating those who are HIV positive. As you know, if you followed this pandemic, there have been decades of stigma and discrimination against individuals who are HIV positive or at risk for HIV. And I think what PEPFAR has done, what the Global Fund is doing, and what host countries that are successful are doing is supporting everybody that could potentially become infected to make sure that they have prevention access to services, but also to ensure that people that are at risk and could be positive have access to the health centers without discrimination and without stigma. And I think you'll see in the countries where we put everything up online, so if you go to pepfar.gov, you'll see all of our data down to the district level, so you can see the impact that we're having. And we track dollars very down to the client to ensure just what you talked about. What clients aren't we reaching? What age groups aren't we reaching? Who have we left behind? And I think that evolves as the epidemic evolves, and that's why we've been very much focused on the data and understanding how the epidemic is moving. And I tell you, our biggest gap right now, since you're a lovely man, it's men. Men don't interact with the healthcare delivery system in almost every place where we work and don't believe they're at risk for HIV/AIDS. So we are really putting on a push with host country governments to really raise the alert so that men know that they're at risk, and men will come to the health center. The health centers often are for women and children, and they don't see themselves there. But I think if we're successful over the next 12 months, men will see themselves in a wellness campaign to really understand and get tested for HIV/AIDS. So thank you for raising the question. Migration, yes. So in areas of conflict where we've had strong programs, like in South Sudan, as South Sudanese have moved into northern Uganda, we have supported programs. Our dollars move with the risk of the individuals that have moved. So we're very careful to follow those migratory patterns. Certainly the European groups and the groups that we work with in Europe also have a very strong HIV/AIDS response. But whether it's South Sudan or Burundi and the issues in the borders, we both supply services in the country itself and in the areas of transition.
Ambassador, thank you so much. She has to go. She's hosting an event over in...
So we hope you come there, too, at 3:45 to see our event and the kiosk.
They have an interactive program, which you can see, and it sort of overlays some of the areas where the programs have been particularly successful. So if anyone has any follow-up questions for the ambassador, I'd be happy to get those to her and put you in touch. A couple announcements I'd like to start off with for this portion of the briefing today. We have talked recently about the Global Entrepreneurship Summit that is taking place in India this week. That concluded today. This year's Global Economic Summit focused on supporting women entrepreneurs and fostering economic growth globally. For all of our progress, gender divides on access to technology, nutrition, and health, preventing women, their families, and their communities from reaching their full potential. In order to close this gap, USAID Administrator Mark Green announced several USAID-led efforts there in India. This includes the Women Connect Challenge, which will help bridge the digital divide, a 2018 Feed the Future competition, a $2 million commitment from Feed the Future designed to lift up and mentor female entrepreneurs in Africa, new funding to help India combat tuberculosis by increasing women's access to diagnosis and treatment, and the launch of USAID's first Health Impact Bond, which is aimed at saving the lives of women and newborns in India. Administrator Green is also going to Mumbai tomorrow to participate in a World AIDS Day event where he will reconfirm the U.S. commitment to ending HIV/AIDS. Another matter, we talk a lot about how safety and security is of Americans overseas and here at home is one of our top priorities. With that, I'd like to bring you a little bit of an update on an American who's been held for quite some time in Venezuela, and that's Josh Holt. The United States calls on the government of Venezuela to release on humanitarian grounds U.S. citizen Josh Holt, who's been detained in Venezuela since June 30th, 2016, almost a year and a half now. Throughout his 17 months in detention so far without charges, we've raised our concerns about Mr. Holt's case, his condition, and his treatment at every opportunity. We remain extremely concerned for his health and his well-being. The decline in his health has been further exacerbated by the Venezuelan authorities' delays in providing necessary medical treatment. Sometimes they have blocked his care altogether. The U.S. Embassy in Caracas continues to raise concerns regarding the Venezuelan government's repeated postponements of and refusal to transport him to scheduled court hearings. Again, we call on the government of Venezuela to grant Mr. Holt immediate release and return him to the United States. Another matter, and this is something that's happening tomorrow that the Secretary will take part in, is a meeting here in Washington with the Libyan Prime Minister. We are pleased to welcome the Libyan Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj and the Libyan delegation to Washington later this week. The President will host the Prime Minister at the White House tomorrow. While in Washington, the Prime Minister and the Libyan delegation will also meet with other U.S. leaders, including Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis tomorrow afternoon. In those meetings, we look forward to deepening the partnership between the United States and Libya. We will reaffirm the United States' support for Prime Minister Sarraj and his government of national accord as the Libyan people seek to build a more stable, unified, and prosperous future. The Secretary looks forward to discussing with Prime Minister Sarraj our shared efforts to defeat ISIS and also other terrorists as well. The Secretary and Prime Minister Sarraj will also discuss the central role of the UN Special Representative SLAMS mediation and the importance of the Libyan efforts to reach a political solution within the framework of the Libyan political agreement. And finally, the Secretary referenced this earlier this week, and this is his upcoming trip to Europe. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will travel to Brussels, Belgium, Vienna, and Paris December 4th through the 8th. On December 4th, he will arrive in Brussels, and that's where he'll meet with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and attend the December 5th through 6th NATO Foreign Ministers meeting. While in Brussels, he'll also meet with senior Belgian officials as well as EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, and the foreign ministers of the 28 European Union member states to discuss U.S.-EU cooperation on major global issues. He will then travel to Vienna on December 7th, where he will attend the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that's OSCE. It's a ministerial conference that's hosted by the OSCE chairman in office, Austrian Foreign Minister Sebastian Kurz. He will then attend the opening and first plenary sessions together with ministers from the 57 OSCE participating states. He will also meet separately with Foreign Minister Kurz to discuss combating violent extremism, curbing nuclear proliferation, promoting democratic and economic reform in the Balkans, and also deepening bilateral trade ties. Finally, Secretary Tillerson will travel to Paris to meet with senior French leaders to discuss our deepening cooperation on issues of mutual concern around the world. This includes Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Libya, the DPRK, and the Sahel, in addition to other areas of bilateral interest. So thank you for listening to all that information we have here out of the State Department. I know you have a lot of questions, especially about the news today, so I'd be happy to take those. Josh, if you'd like to start from EP.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. Why don't we go right to the elephant in the room? Many of our news organizations are being...
Let me just pause by saying I'm sorry, I have allergies, and so I've got a little bit of a cough today. So
No problem, sure. The White House officials are telling many news organizations represented here that Secretary Tillerson is on his way out. He's going to be replaced by CIA Director Pompeo. Is that accurate? Has the secretary spoken to Trump about this today, and how long does he expect to remain in his role?
Okay, so here's what I can tell you. You saw the White House statement earlier today. The White House statement confirmed that there will be no personnel changes. It is a fact that Secretary Tillerson serves at the pleasure of the president, as we all do, as does every political appointee and cabinet member. Secretary Tillerson enjoys this job. He has a lot of work to do. We started out this morning together, and he had a series of meetings. In addition to his regularly scheduled meetings with Washington officials and phone calls, he had a meeting with the Foreign Minister Gabriel of Germany. The Secretary and I spoke at that time. We talked a little bit about Burma. We talked a little bit about the DPRK. The Secretary had a successful meeting, which I'd like to get to a little bit later and tell you a little bit about what came out of that bilateral meeting. And then he was off to the White House. We heard about the news. He went off to the White House with a regularly scheduled meeting with Bahrain and the president, returned here for a short while, and then he headed back to the White House for an additional meeting, which was a preset meeting, a small principals group meeting. The topic of that is Syria. The reason I'm telling you about sort of all these comings and goings of the secretary is that he remains, as I have been told, committed to doing this job. He does serve at the pleasure of the president. This is a job that he enjoys. He's continuing with his meetings. He's continuing with his calls. He has spoken not only with Foreign Minister Gabriel, but also with the UN Secretary General earlier today, and so he's continuing with a full schedule.
How does he go about doing his job with this hanging over him? I mean, he's going to go off to Europe on Monday. You know, what reason would foreign governments have to believe that he speaks on behalf of President Trump when the White House is letting it be known publicly that they don't have confidence in him anymore?
The secretary is someone whose feathers don't get ruffled very easily. He kind of, brushed this off today. He's heard these kinds of stories before. These stories have come up through his tenure here at the State Department, and he's just going on about his business. In terms of how he will handle the meetings next week, he has a very robust schedule. These are matters that he'll be discussing that he is passionate about, from our relationship with the Europeans to NATO and asking various NATO countries for additional commitments in Afghanistan, something we view as being important to addressing the good and solid relationships we have with the European partners. So he has a big agenda. That agenda has certainly not changed. He remains the Secretary of State. As long as he is serving at the pleasure of the President, he will continue to do that job.
But you're not saying that these rumors are groundless. Are you saying that they are completely false and groundless?
Here's what I know. I don't work at the White House, but what I can tell you is that that Chief of Staff Kelly called our department this morning and said that the rumors are not true, that those reports are not true. That is what I've been told. That's what we've been told. And you heard from the White House today that they have no personnel changes to announce.
So wouldn't it be, the right thing to do for the White House to issue a statement on the eve of the Secretary's departure on such a major trip to say that these rumors are groundless, if that is the case?
I'm not going to tell the White House how to conduct its business. The Chief of Staff has spoken to reporters. I believe he did a gaggle earlier today in which he spoke to reporters and said that this report is not true. Sarah Sanders has spoken to reporters as well. I believe she has a briefing a little bit later today. I'm sure many of you want to cover that as well. So I'd have to let the White House speak for itself. But from our standpoint here at the State Department, we remain committed to our job. As you saw, Ambassador Birx was here talking about the successes of our global AIDS program. And we're just continuing with business as usual.
Did the Secretary discuss this with the President when he was over at the White House?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. How do you characterize the chemistry between Secretary Tillerson and Mr. John Kelly?
Yeah, between Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Kelly, or Chief of Staff Kelly?
Chief of Staff.
I was told I was not at the White House today. I was here. I was told that it was normal, the same as usual, that the Secretary was treated the same as he always is. That's what I was told.
Who did John Kelly speak with when he called this morning? And I mean, you said not to your knowledge that there was any discussion between the president and secretary, so there was no personal assurance during his time over at the White House today?
Again, I was not there, so I hesitate to say too much because I was not there to see it myself. But some of that would be considered private discussions, but I don't believe that conversation took place.
Okay, and the call to this department today.
The
from
call to
John
the department
Kelly
came into the chief of staff this morning. There may have
to
been.
Margaret Peterlin.
Correct. There may have been subsequent calls that have taken place. If so, if something's happened since we've been in this briefing room, I'm not aware of it. Okay. Hi, Kyla.
Hey, does the secretary want to keep this job? Does he feel that he's doing a good job? He's come under, incredible pressure from outsiders, from Congress. Does he want to keep the job?
The secretary is somebody who's unflappable. I mean, you've seen him here before. He's somebody who is committed to his job. He's someone who is very passionate about speaking with world leaders and advancing U.S. foreign policy goals. He continues with his schedule and the schedule that we have put out, and that schedule hasn't changed. So I believe that that is something that he's committed to doing.
Will he fight to keep the job should they decide that they're going to go on with someone else?
That would be just speculation, a hypothetical that I'm not going to get into. Okay? Connor.
Does he feel pressure from the White House? I mean, given this leak, and we've done this now for a couple months of people at the White House leaking unflattering stories about him and his relationship with the president. Does he feel pressure to resign from the White House?
I think what he feels is that Washington can be a tough game of politics. You've heard him reference that before, that he's not from Washington, he's not a person of Washington, and he doesn't always understand and accept exactly how Washington works, with anonymous sources, things of that nature. That's not who he is, that's not the world that he comes from. Okay.
Follow up on that?
Yeah, go right ahead.
How would you characterize his relationship with the president? Some of these reports, it's been reported that it is soured over the last couple of months in particular.
Well, certainly they will have areas of disagreement when it comes to policy. I mean, that's no doubt, and that's very clear. The secretary has spoken to that himself and has said, that's part of the reason that the president hired him, so that he could have different opinions being given to the president, and the president could ultimately make his decision on various policy issues. So they have had areas of disagreement when it's come to policy. I know that the president certainly respects Secretary Tillerson. I know that they've had certainly a cordial relationship. Where that relationship is today, I can't speak to that.
Ringing endorsement.
Well, I have not personally been in the room with the secretary and the president at the same time. So there's not too much that I can really say about that, other than the secretary serves at the pleasure of the president, and the secretary had 2 meetings with the president today. Okay. Go ahead, Nike.
Secretary Tillerson and President have some areas of disagreement on policy.
Well, they have in the past, certainly, on things like climate change and all of that. You know that.
Right. Does that also include the latest retweet on the anti-Muslim video, and has the State Department warned the White House that such retweet may cause repercussion?
One of the things we will always say is the safety and security of our American personnel and of U.S. citizens abroad is our top concern. The State Department has continuous conversations with the White House and the National Security Council about anything that could affect any Americans' safety and security abroad. When it comes to specific conversations, you know all too well that I can't comment on our sort of private internal conversations, but it wouldn't be unusual for us to have those kinds of conversations about any matter in the world.
Has the State Department warned the White House such retweet may put the U.S. embassies abroad at risk?
I will tell you again, we have lots of communications with the White House and NSC about a variety of security issues. I don't know that yesterday or today is any different than it was in the past. Okay, Carol, hi.
Did the Secretary speak with Secretary Mattis today? I know they speak frequently, and did they discuss this in particular?
I believe, let me double check the schedule, but I seem to recall that Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson met early this morning.
And did they discuss this in particular, these rumors?
Again, let me take a double check the schedule about that, but I believe it was early this morning that they met. Again, early this morning, that was before this news broke.
Could you check also to see if Secretary Tillerson spoke with General Kelly when he was at the White House?
I told you, they did speak when they were at the White House.
At the White House, I'm sorry.
Yes. Hold on, okay, hold on. Go ahead, Josh.
Can you tell us whether, based on the divestiture agreement that the Secretary entered with the Government Ethics Office, whether he would face any tax or financial implications if he were to leave, particularly if he were to leave before the 1-year mark?
I've seen that story. I'm certainly aware of that report. A lot of people have started to ask about that. I have no knowledge of how that financial situation would work. I can certainly look into it. I'm not sure I'm going to have an answer for you. However, I have spoken with various reputable news organizations, I won't name them, but some of them are in the room today, who have all said that they've run down that story and have found no basis in fact for that. But again, that's based on what reporters here in the room have told me about that story. Okay, hold on, let's stay, well, we're going to stay with this before we go into that.
Yeah, it's a follow-up on the embassies.
Yes.
Some embassies in some Muslim countries enhanced their security protocols since yesterday and those tweets.
We would never address security protocols that either have or have not changed at our embassy. That's something that we keep close to the vest here at the State Department. We have talked about this the other day, a brand new Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security who has a very big job, not only overseeing our more than 2,000 diplomatic security agents who work for the State Department, but also our locally employed staff who are security officials who help protect our embassies. And by the way, we have the Marines out there as well. In terms of changing our security posture, that's just not something we're going to get into. Okay, anything else on that? Okay. Hey, Gardner.
Josh's point, don't these rumors and these stories, which have now been reported widely by many different outlets, don't they make the Secretary's job very challenging? Because won't his counterparts in Europe next week be asking themselves who Tillerson is speaking for? Because these stories suggest that he no longer speaks for the president or has the president's confidence.
Look, I can tell you this. After meeting with the foreign minister of Germany today, and then the story broke as we were emerging from that meeting with the German foreign minister. Fast forward a couple hours, and I see an AFP report that talks about one of the issues that came up in the meeting with the foreign minister of Germany, and that is Germany's decision to reduce its diplomatic mission in Pyongyang and require North Korea to reduce its presence in Berlin. That is a subject that came up today between the secretary and the foreign minister. That is something that is a part of our maximum pressure campaign to take money out of North Korea, to try to choke off the money that goes into North Korea, that goes into its ballistic and nuclear programs. The reason I mentioned this, Gardner, is that this story came out after that meeting. This story came out a few hours later. That is important and that is significant because the foreign minister made this decision, put that information out there after this news broke. What I'm saying is that the secretary has his position. He is the Secretary of State. He will continue with that position, continue doing his job, continue doing his duty and serving the American public until the president, if and when the president decides that he no longer wants to keep the secretary in his position. Okay? Yes.
Yes. That you keep mentioning that you cannot share with us the diplomatic conversations. But if you see the top level, President and the Prime Minister of the UK are talking directly on the Twitter. And so what else is left to not to be shared with us?
Well, that would be between those the governments. You mean the president and UK? I can't speak for the president, and I certainly can't speak for the British Prime Minister.
What else is left? At what level there are more
I'm
talks?
sure I'm not following your question. Are you suggesting that the only conversations that take place between world leaders is on Twitter?
No, I'm talking about the department. Are the departments having a conversation to do the damage control?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
When the president tweets and the UK Prime Minister replies and then the president replies,
yes,
there is a level of conversation going on. And then you say that there are also conversations at the lower levels or other levels which you cannot share with us because they are private.
So nothing has changed. Often we do not discuss the contents of our diplomatic conversation. I mean, you'll hear many of your colleagues here complaining about that. There are some things that we choose to keep private. That hasn't changed. But I can't comment on the conversations that the White House is having with other nations. Okay?
All the way back, please.
Hi, what are you doing all the way back there?
Well, I came in late, so I didn't want to
okay.
disturb
Well, that's
things.
very polite of you. Good to see you.
So could you give us a little more detail about the call that was taken from General Kelly? And you say that he told, I guess, the Secretary of State that these reports aren't true. Could you talk about what else he said, how he explained the fact that every major news organization was reporting this out of the White House today?
I'm not going to characterize what Chief of Staff Kelly, what exactly he said. I think that would be for General Kelly to explain himself. But I know that he did place a phone call this morning and say that there was nothing to that report of having a plan in place. Wait, hold
He
on.
spoke with who?
I told you that. I already told you that. He spoke with our Chief of Staff this morning. Yes. Okay. Okay. Hi, sir. Okay.
Deputy
You know, why don't we do
Assistant.
this? Let's get through these stories, and then I will come back to you, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on this issue? Okay, we'll change topic then. Okay, we'll go to Nord Stream 2.
Nord Stream 2.
And I'm sorry, you're with
I'm
who, sir?
Marek Walkowski, Polish Public Radio.
Okay, nice to
Uh,
meet you. Welcome to the State Department.
Deputy Assistant Secretary McCarrick told a group of European journalists that, I quote, "We don't see the possibility that Nord Stream 2 is going to be built. That's not something that we are going to assume is going to happen." Could you explain what is the statement based on? And I'm wondering if the topic has been discussed during the meeting between Secretary Tillerson and German Foreign Minister, and what's the conclusion of their discussion, if in fact it was one of the topics?
Yeah, I can tell you that that conversation did not come up. The Secretary and the Foreign Minister had a very positive meeting in which they talked about the DPRK, North Korea. They talked about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and the importance of Saudi Arabia opening additional ports and ways that we can get humanitarian aid into Yemen. They talked about a few other matters as well. Nord Stream 2 was not one of the topics that came up in my presence. Now, they may have had a separate sideline conversation that I did not witness, so that may have come up. In terms of where exactly we are on Nord Stream 2, pardon me one second. Another topic related to that is the multi-line Turkish stream, as I understand it. So our position on this would be that Europe is certainly working to try to diversify where it gets its energy. I've spoken with some of your colleagues before, people from that part of the world as well, and recognizing that there should be and could be more sources of energy. We have seen in the very cold winter months where Vladimir Putin, which is where a lot of your energy comes from, in particular in Poland, where he will turn off those energy supplies, causing costs to go up and causing people to lose heat on occasion. So we know that Europe is working to diversify its energy sector overall. It's also assessing projects that would undermine some of these efforts. We agree with many of our European partners that Nord Stream 2 and a multi-line Turkish stream would reinforce Russian dominance in Europe's gas markets. It would reduce opportunities for diversification of energy sources. It would pose security risks in an already tense Baltic Sea region, and it would advance Russia's goal of undermining Ukraine, that's a particular concern of ours, by ending Ukraine's role as a transit country for Russian gas exports to get to Europe. Construction of Nord Stream 2 would concentrate about 75% of Russian gas imports to the EU through a single route, creating a potential checkpoint that would significantly increase Europe's vulnerability to a supply disruption. So we believe that these two projects would enable Gazprom to cut off transit via Ukraine and still meet demand in Western Europe, which would economically undermine Ukraine by depriving it of about $2 billion in annual transit revenue.
But
Okay?
is the
Yeah.
statement correct that you don't believe that the project would be built, that the Nord Stream 2 would be built? And Secretary Tillerson called recently the Nord Stream 2 unwise. What are you doing to stop this unwise project?
So, sir, I don't have the Secretary's comments in front of me, so I hesitate to comment on having something
2 days
that
ago at the Woodrow Wilson
I
Center.
understand. I just don't have the exact quote in
Okay.
front of me, so I'm just not going to comment on that. And the other person who made a remark, I'm afraid I don't have that with me either. So, okay?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, North Korea.
Yesterday, in a briefing you gave, you specifically called on Germany to withdraw its ambassador from North Korea.
That was misreported. I'd like to go back, and if you want to check the transcript, actually, I did not call on Germany to get rid of its ambassador. What we did, and what we often do, as you've heard me many times here before, is call upon countries to do a lot more. To do a lot more, which could include kicking out an ambassador. It could include reducing the size of the footprint of that country. It could include reducing the number of North Korean guest workers. There were some reporters who misreported that, so I just want to make that clear.
The quote, if maybe this isn't accurate, but you said we would continue to ask Germany or other countries around the world to recall those ambassadors, shrink the footprint of the size of the entity that North Korea has in any given country. I mean, so when you said
that is nothing new. We ask
to recall those ambassadors.
We ask a lot of those countries to do that type of thing. Certainly.
Okay, so did the secretary today ask the foreign minister of Germany to recall his ambassador?
The secretary did not specifically ask that, but the conversation did come up, and that's why I mentioned that AFP story that came out earlier today that said that they would. Just go back and double check it, but that they would, I believe they said, reduce the size of their footprint,
so
reduce its diplomatic mission.
Was he disappointed that the Germans have not recalled their ambassador? I mean, Nikki Haley yesterday was very explicit at the UN. They want countries around the world to completely cut off diplomatic ties with North Korea. Germany is saying essentially, sure, we'll reduce staff, but we're going to leave this embassy open.
I think this is a success. The news that we have seen come out of Germany, as with many other nations, we've seen this with Peru, we've seen it with Japan, we've seen it with South Korea, we've seen it with Sudan, where Sudan has recently said that it's no longer going to buy weapons from the DPRK. That is all a part of our maximum pressure campaign. That maximum pressure campaign, which you all probably get tired of hearing me talk about, is something that is our top national security priority here. Nations continue to get on board and support that. We have well north of 20 countries who have done different things to jump on board with that campaign. And I think the news that's coming out of Germany today is altogether positive. Okay. Saeed.
On that subject.
Okay, hold on. Okay.
Can you just sort of again be explicit? Do you want all of your allies to end diplomatic ties, withdraw their ambassadors from Pyongyang? Because we're hearing from your allies, from U.S. allies, that they have no intention of withdrawing their ambassadors, and that in their conversations with the Trump administration is not asking them to withdraw their ambassadors or end diplomatic ties. So what are you asking them specifically to do?
Well, one of the things that we have talked about here in this administration is the importance of sovereign nations, right? So nations have the ability to make the choices that are best or that they believe are best for their nations. However, we all, civilized nations, recognize the constant and pervasive threat of the DPRK. We saw what just happened 2 days ago with what we believe may have been an intercontinental ballistic missile launch, in addition to the other launches that North Korea has conducted and the advanced nuclear testing that they conducted just a few months ago. So we have seen all of that. The world recognizes what a regional and global threat North Korea is, that North Korea presents. So many countries in the world are on board with this campaign, on board with the maximum pressure campaign. But countries have to make their own decisions about what will work best for them.
What is the campaign? Do you want them to all close their embassies and withdraw all their diplomatic personnel from Pyongyang?
I can give you transcript and transcript and transcript of the briefings from here, Gardner, or from the Secretary Tillerson's meetings about our maximum pressure campaign. I can briefly go over it once again. Sorry, you all have heard it.
No, just the ambassador.
You all have heard it a million times.
Because they're telling us that they're not hearing from you that you want their missions to be shuttered and all their ambassadors withdrawn.
I have not heard from any particular ambassadors with that question. I've not gotten that question from any particular ambassadors. If we do and I know about it, I can certainly let you know, but we've not gotten that question so far.
But you want them to all withdraw their ambassadors,
Look,
is that right?
Here's what I would say, and I'm not in the position to make policy, so I am not going to do that. But a key part of our maximum pressure campaign is to ask other nations, and again, let me underscore that countries are all sovereign. Okay, they need to do what they feel is in their best interest. That is something that this administration recognizes. But we ask countries to choke off the money supply that goes into North Korea. We know for a fact that North Korea doesn't use the money that comes into its government or to its people for the benefit of its people. They don't feed their people. They have people starving, malnourished. We've all seen that. You've seen the intestinal problems that the soldier who just escaped from North Korea has certainly had, all of that. So we know the money doesn't go to the people. We know the money goes to its illegal weapons programs. So we have called on countries across the world to join us in that maximum pressure campaign in reducing the size of their missions in North Korea. If they would be willing to close their missions in North Korea altogether, I think that that is something that we would be supportive of. We've also called on nations to kick out North Korean guest workers, to reduce the size of North Korean missions in their own countries. It's a broad pressure campaign. We also have the unilateral sanctions and all of that, in addition to the UN Security Council resolutions. Okay? Okay, let's move on.
Thank you, Heather. Let me just ask you very quickly. Today marks the end of the 6-month waiver for maintaining your embassy in Tel Aviv and moving it to Jerusalem. Do you have any news on that? Is the president going to likely sign another waiver for another 6 months?
I know everyone would like to speculate about that.
What is your position?
So I can just tell you that no decision has been made on that matter yet. My understanding is that the waiver is actually due to Congress by December 4th, which would be
Monday.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think you had said today.
Yeah.
The president has said that he's given serious consideration to the matter, and we're looking at it with great care. That's all I have for you on that.
Okay. Is the secretary talking to the president on this issue? Because in past administrations, the Secretary of State always presented the case as to why this would be a bad decision for the United States at this particular time.
I know that
there's some sort of process ongoing.
Yeah, the Secretary is talking to the White House about that matter, and I know we're having a lot of conversations about that as well. But again, I want to underscore that no decision has been made yet.
And one last question. When you determined that the office of the PLO must remain open, you said that we want to limit their activities to the peace process. Does that include the movement of the ambassador and his staff, let's say when they are called by the Palestinian American community in San Francisco to speak or anything? How do you limit their activities to that particular area?
I'm not aware of that particular scenario that you outlined.
Right.
That is not one that I had heard of.
Okay.
But
Well, it says, it's therefore, you're saying that it's optimistic, that you are optimistic in 90 days or in 3 months, the situation will be such that would allow the office to remain operational fully. But also you say that they must limit their activities to the peace process. What does that mean?
Okay, so we have advised the PLO office to limit its activities to those related to achieving a lasting, comprehensive peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We're actively involved in restarting what we consider to be substantial Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. We have found, and we talked about this coming out of the UN General Assembly, both parties have been cooperative. The conversations have been constructive, and we believe that both sides are prepared to engage in negotiations. The statute that you reference provides that if after 90 days the president determines that the Palestinians are engaged in direct and meaningful negotiations with Israel, restrictions on the PLO and its Washington office may be lifted. You referenced this also. We remain optimistic that at the end of that 90-day period, the political process may be sufficiently advanced and that the president will be in the position to allow the PLO office to resume full operations. Okay?
Iraq. There's not been a decision yet on what we're going to do on the embassy waiver. Why has the State Department informed diplomatic posts in Muslim countries that they need to be on edge for violence around this?
I think that is something we would never discuss. Any conversations that our State Department is having with our posts around the world, so I just can't give you anything on that. Okay?
Can I just follow on that, though?
Yeah.
The Vice President has said it's not a matter of if, but when. So, this could be the time when it comes. So are you making contingency plans at all
We would never discuss any potential security contingency plans, at least certainly not that I'm aware of. You know that that's something, we talked about that earlier, that we keep pretty closely held. Okay? Last question, we're going to have to wrap. Lori, hi.
All right. The Chaldean Archbishop of Erbil has been here seeking financial support because Baghdad has said he has no money for reconstruction. Did anyone here in this building meet with him, and is the administration going to assist with the reconstruction for the 100,000 Christians who have refugees from Nineveh province?
In terms of the meeting, I'm not aware of any actual meetings that were held between the Chaldean Archbishop and anyone at the State Department, so I'm not aware of any of that taking place. I can tell you, as a general matter, we are deeply committed, we've talked about this before, to the world's most vulnerable people. That includes ethnic and religious minorities. We're particularly concerned with people who are suffering in conflict affected areas, and we are steadfast in our resolve to ensure that those communities get the assistance that they need. We are a generous nation. We have provided a lot in terms of humanitarian assistance to Iraq and other nations around the world. We have also, however, said that we are no longer in the building or in the business of nation building. What we've been doing in Iraq and Syria is stabilization. Helping to get the water turned back on, the electricity flowing, kids back in schools. But in terms of building roads and bridges and large-scale reconstruction projects, like we saw the United States engaged in 10 plus years ago, that's something that the U.S. government is no longer involved with. We, instead, will look to other nations to assist with that as well. We are continuing to assist with those programs, but other nations will help pick up the tab also.
So you don't know of any specific funds that for what?
I can tell you that we are exploring different initiatives with various NGOs in order to assist.
Okay. And one more question. Hadi al-Amri, head of the Popular Mobilization Forces, had said that U.S. troops must leave Iraq once ISIS is defeated. Mm-hmm. What's your comment on that?
Yeah. Overall, the United States, as we are in other countries as well, we're there at the request of the government. We are there at the request of the Iraqi government. We are there to defeat ISIS. That's all I have for you on that, okay?
So if his plan is to use the parliament to put pressure on the Iraqi government to ask U.S. forces to leave, if that happens, you'll just pick up and leave?
Laura, I just don't have anything more for you on that. We are there at the request of the Iraqi government, okay? I'll take one last one, Alicia. Go ahead.
On the Nobel Peace Prize,
okay.
Could you comment on the U.S. decision to not send its ambassador to attend the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony this year, honoring the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons?
Yep. I have a few notes on that one right here, as a matter of fact. So the United States was not the only country to not send its ambassador. The United Kingdom, France, and the United States agreed on our attendance with the Nobel Institute. The United States will be represented instead of by its ambassador by the acting deputy chief of mission to the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony on December 10th in Oslo. The United States is overall committed to preserving peace and creating the conditions for nuclear disarmament. That's a goal, of course, we share with many other nations.
And could you comment on whether this is indeed an ideological decision to not attend because ICANN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this year?
Look, I don't have anything more for you on that. It was a decision that was made on the part of the U.S. government and other governments as well, not just the United States. Okay, thanks everybody.